Blue and red lights cut through a lonely highway in Mississippi. But this isn't just another traffic stop. It's the moment when arrogance collides with hidden power. An old man in a beat-up truck carries secrets that could shake the nation, and two officers are about to learn the cost of assumption. Stay hooked, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share this story. You won't believe what happens next. The night was heavy along Highway 41, the kind of silence that presses against the windows and turns every sound into something sharper, more threatening. The highway cut through rural Mississippi like a black ribbon lined with pine trees that swayed slowly in the wind. No towns for 10 miles in either direction, no porch lights, no passing cars. Just the distant hum of cicadas and the whisper of asphalt beneath worn tires. When the flashing blue and red lights tore across the darkness, they didn't just announce authority, they split the stillness like a blade. Officer Brent Mallory leaned forward in the driver's seat of his cruiser, one hand draped lazily over the wheel, the other brushing against the worn leather holster of his sidearm. He had the grin of a man who enjoyed the pullover more than the paperwork, who thrived on being the one in control. With a swagger that could be felt even in the way he hit the siren twice, sharp and short, he steered the cruiser behind the dented Ford pickup that had rolled to the shoulder. Dust rose in the beams of the headlights, curling into the night air like smoke from a slow fire. Mallory was known in the county. He walked tall in the diner, loud in the bar, his badge as much a weapon as the pistol on his hip. He carried himself like a man untouchable because, so far, he had been. He had a reputation for squeezing fear from people the way a hand squeezes water from a rag, firm, casual, inevitable. Tonight his mood was already soured. Too quiet on patrol, too long without something to break the monotony. And here, it was an old Ford pickup, dented on the side, crawling along the shoulder like it had something to hide. Mallory's eyes narrowed. He lived for this. Beside him sat Officer Ethan Cole, the rookie. 23 years old, barely 3 months out of the academy, with a clean face and nervous energy that clung to him like sweat. He watched Mallory the way a child might watch a teacher waiting for cues, afraid to misstep. Cole hadn't yet learned the rhythm of silence that seasoned officers carried like armor. He still filled the empty moments with questions, still believed in procedure, like the textbooks promised. But Mallory had already begun shaping him, showing him how the badge wasn't about rules. It was about power. Cole's fingers tapped against his thigh, his voice soft when he asked, "You think it's worth pulling him over for just a busted taillight?" Mallory's grin widened wolf-like. "Son, everything's worth pulling over if you know what you're looking for." The pickup sat idle, its taillights glowing faintly paint, dulled by decades of weather. Inside, barely visible through the rear window, sat Calvin Mercer. 68 years old, though he carried it like stone-solid, unflinching, carved by time rather than eroded. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, knuckles lined but steady. His posture wasn't rigid, not defensive. It was calm, unnervingly calm, as though he had been waiting not minutes, but years for this very moment. His eyes, shadowed by the brim of a faded cap, did not flicker to the mirrors in panic. He did not fumble for papers or reach hastily toward the glove box. He simply waited. Mallory stepped out of the cruiser boots, hitting the gravel shoulder with heavy finality. He adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and approached with the practiced strut of a man who had done this hundreds of times before. Cole followed a few paces behind his hand, hovering near his pistol in imitation of Mallory, though his movements lacked the confidence. The air between the two officers and the truck was charged in visible tension, stretching thinner with every step. When Mallory reached the driver's side window, he leaned an elbow on the rusted door like it belonged to him. His flashlight beam swept across the interior, bouncing off the cracked vinyl dashboard and landing on Mercer's face. What Mallory saw was not fear, not even irritation, just stillness. Mercer's eyes met his steady and unwavering, and something in that gaze unsettled him immediately. It wasn't a stare meant to provoke, nor one meant to submit. It was the look of a man who had already measured Mallory and found him insignificant. Mallory's jaw tightened. He hated that look. License and registration. Mallory barked, his voice sharp, cutting the air like the beam of his flashlight. Mercer didn't move quickly. He shifted slowly, deliberately, each action purposeful, as though narrating without words. I am not a threat. I am in control of myself. I will not be rushed. To Mallory it felt like defiance. He felt the irritation crawl up his spine, twisting his smirk into something harder. Beside him, Cole adjusted his stance, trying to mimic his senior's confidence, but he couldn't hide the flicker of unease crossing his face as he studied the man in the truck. Right here, Officer Mercer finally said, his voice low, a deep rumble that carried more weight than volume. He held out the papers, steady hands betraying no nerves. His tone wasn't submissive, nor was it hostile. It was the voice of a man used to being heard, without having to raise it. Cole blinked at the sound, recognizing something in it that Mallory missed. Something disciplined. Something old. Mallory snatched the document's eyes, scanning the name. Calvin Mercer. He made a show of sounding it out slowly, deliberately twisting the syllables like a man cracking his knuckles. Mercer, he said, with mock gravity, the corners of his mouth twitching in disdain. Clean record, nothing on file. That only deepened his suspicion. To Mallory, clean records didn't mean innocence. They meant something hadn't been found yet. Cole shifted his weight. He noticed the jacket Mercer wore, an old army field coat frayed at the seams, but meticulously clean. The kind of jacket no civilian picked up at a thrift store. Cole's eyes lingered, his mouth opening slightly, before he caught himself. Mercer, still calm, seemed to notice the glance. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, you see it. But Cole said nothing. Mallory, irritated by the silence, leaned closer to the window. What brings you out on this stretch of road, old man? His voice carried the false warmth of someone already sharpening their blade. Mercer didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, the dark ribbon stretching endlessly into night. Just driving home, he answered simply. But Mallory wasn't satisfied. He never was. Something about this man, this calm, unshaken quiet, scratched at the edges of his authority. He wanted fear. He wanted excuses. He wanted to see Mercer stumble. Instead, he was staring at a stone. The air between them thickened, silence stretching too long until even the cicadas seemed to hush. Cole swallowed hard, sensing something shift, though he couldn't name it. Mallory's knuckles tightened on the flashlight, the grin gone, now replaced with something darker. And on Highway 41, under the glow of red and blue lights, the stage was set. One man with arrogance and authority, another with calm and history, and between them, the rookie caught in silence. What should have been a simple stop was already curdling into something far more dangerous. The gravel crunched under Mallory's boots as he leaned closer to the window, the weight of his authority pressing as heavily as the beam of his flashlight. The air along Highway 41 had shifted the still night, now a taut wire strung between two men. In the glow of flashing lights, Mallory's face hardened into the expression he wore best, predatory, humorless, certain of his control. License and registration, he snapped again, this time with a tone sharper than before, like he was daring Mercer to move in a way he didn't approve of. Inside the dented Ford pickup, Calvin Mercer did not rush. He turned with the slow precision of someone who had lived long enough to know that sudden movements carried consequences. His hands moved across the cracked vinyl seat, like water moving over stone, each gesture deliberate, each pause intentional. He reached for the worn leather wallet resting against the dashboard and the folded papers tucked neatly into its sleeve. When he extended them toward Mallory, his hand was steady, his face calm, his eyes never leaving the dark stretch of road ahead. But that composure, quiet, controlled, almost regal, landed like an insult in Mallory's chest. He wanted unease. He wanted nervousness. He wanted to see Mercer stumble or sweat under the weight of a badge and a flashlight beam. Instead, all he got was patience, and patience felt like defiance. "Took your time, didn't you?" Mallory muttered, snatching the papers with exaggerated force. The thin sheets crinkled loudly in his grip. "You people think moving slow makes you smart, makes you look calm. To me, it looks like you're trying to hide something." His words dripped with venom, not so much directed at Mercer as spoken loud enough for Cole to hear, because Mallory was always teaching, always performing, always sculpting the rookie into his shadow. Cole shifted his weight uneasily, his hand hovering near his service pistol, though his instincts told him there was no threat here. His eyes flickered down toward Mercer's jacket, catching the faint outline of a patch sewn into the faded green fabric. The insignia was old military, not the kind you bought at a surplus store, but the kind you carried from battlefields half a world away. Cole recognized enough to know it meant service, maybe special service, though he kept his mouth shut. Mallory wouldn't care. Mallory would see it as just another story, another excuse. Cole pressed his lips together, his silence heavy with a truth he wasn't ready to voice. Mercer didn't look at Mallory, not directly. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the road vanished into night. The calm in his face wasn't arrogance, it was the composure of a man who had stared down storms far greater than this. But to Mallory, it felt like a challenge. He rifled through the documents, shining his flashlight across Mercer's name. Clean record. No outstanding warrants. Registration current. Insurance valid. Everything perfectly in order. For a deputy like Mallory, that was the most suspicious thing of all. "Where you headed this time of night?" Mallory pressed voice dripping with suspicion. Mercer's reply came steady, unhurried. "Home." A single word, simple, absolute, carrying no more weight than necessary. It was the kind of answer that didn't bend, didn't explain itself, didn't grant Mallory the satisfaction of justification, and that single syllable stoked the deputy's anger hotter than any insult could have. Cole cleared his throat softly, like he wanted to intervene, but he stopped himself. He could feel the tension rising, building like static before a lightning strike. He glanced again at the patch on Mercer's sleeve, the faint stitching of a unit he couldn't fully place. His gut told him there was more to this man than Mallory understood, but his training told him to follow the lead of his senior officer. And so, he stayed quiet. Mallory leaned down further, his voice lowering but thick with venom. "You got a busted taillight. That's enough for a stop. But I don't like what I'm seeing here." His flashlight flicked across the dashboard, the seats, the glove box. He tapped the butt of the flashlight against the doorframe like a gavel announcing judgment. "Why don't you go ahead and pop that glove compartment for me?" Mercer finally turned his head, his eyes meeting Mallory's with a steadiness that stopped Cole's breath. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even resistance. It was the quiet gaze of a man who had measured Mallory's worth and found it hollow. "Are you looking for something specific, officer?" he asked, his voice flat, but resonant. The question was simple, almost polite, but it landed with the weight of accusation. Mallory straightened, bristling at the audacity. "Routine search," He lied his voice, carrying that practiced condescension. "Standard procedure when we stop a vehicle like yours." The words "like yours" hung in the night air, like smoke thick with implication. Cole shifted again, discomfort rising in his gut. But Mallory was already pressing forward, his hand grazing the edge of his holster, as if daring Mercer to refuse. For a long beat, Mercer didn't move. The silence stretched, filled only by the low hum of cicadas and the steady thrum of the cruiser's idling engine. Then finally Mercer's voice cut through the night. "There's a sidearm in the glove box," he said evenly. "A Colt M1911. It's registered." His delivery was calm, factual, stripped of any defensiveness. He wasn't confessing. He was informing. Mallory's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. He had been waiting for this something tangible he could twist into justification. He leaned back toward Cole, his voice low but triumphant. "You hear that? He just admitted he's got a gun in the truck. Didn't declare it until I asked." Mallory turned back to Mercer, his flashlight beam stabbing across the man's face. "You trying to get slick with me, old man, hiding weapons in your car like that?" Mercer's reply was razor-sharp in its simplicity. "You didn't ask." The words dropped like stones in water, rippling through the air between them. Cole flinched, the rookie's stomach tightening at the honesty in that reply. But Mallory heard only defiance. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the flashlight as he yanked open the truck door. "Out. Hands where I can see them. Now." His voice was sharp, a whip crack across the stillness. Mercer stepped out slowly, his movements fluid, his hands, open palms outward, a picture of compliance. But the composure in his stance, the refusal to tremble, the deliberate grace of each step, infuriated Mallory more than outright resistance ever could. To the deputy, control was about breaking men down, and Mercer would not break. Cole watched with unease as Mallory shoved Mercer toward the truck, already reaching for the handcuffs that hung like trophies from his belt. Something in Cole's gut screamed that this was wrong, that this wasn't the way procedure was supposed to work. His eyes flicked once more to the military patch on Mercer's jacket, the quiet emblem of a life lived in service, perhaps in sacrifice. But his training, his fear of Mallory, and his silence held him in place. On Highway 41, under the pulse of blue and red, the clash had begun not with violence, but with something sharper, the refusal of one man to bow and the desperation of another to force him to. What should have been a routine stop was now an unraveling, each second pulling the thread tighter toward something neither officer could fully understand. The night along Highway 41 thickened as if the pines themselves were holding their breath, watching the standoff between authority and dignity unfold. The cicadas had grown quieter, the wind slower, the air so still it carried every scrape of boot against gravel like thunder. Calvin Mercer stood outside his dented Ford pickup, his weathered hands raised slightly, palms open to the flashing strobes of blue and red that painted the highway's shoulder in violent colors. His voice carried the same calm it had since the stop began, unshaken, measured. "There's a sidearm in the glove box," he said evenly, his words cutting through the tension like a clean blade. "A Colt 45. Registered." It was a declaration without drama, the simple truth laid bare. He spoke as a man who had nothing to fear because he had lived too long with real danger. But for Deputy Brent Mallory, the words were not a statement. They were a spark. His eyes lit with something predatory, a grin flickering at the edge of his mouth, as if Mercer had handed him not a fact, but a confession. To Mallory, every syllable dripped with guilt. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the crack he could wedge his authority into and pry wide until it broke. He straightened, savoring it, his flashlight beam stabbing across Mercer's lined face like an interrogation lamp. "A Colt 45, huh?" Mallory sneered, drawing out the syllables. "You know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like a felony waiting to happen." Mercer's eyes shifted toward him, calm but resolute. "It's legal. The permit is in my wallet. Back pocket." He delivered the words with the same slow precision that marked all his movements, the cadence of someone used to being obeyed, without needing to raise his voice. But Mallory wasn't listening. He didn't want legality. He wanted leverage. He wanted the old man in front of him to bend. And when Mercer refused to bend, Mallory decided he would force him. He stepped in one hand, snapping to Mercer's shoulder with the practiced aggression of a man who had spent years masking insecurity with brute force. He spun Mercer around and shoved him against the cold steel side of the truck, the hollow echo of impact rattling down the empty highway. Hands on the hood, Mallory barked, his voice edged with mock triumph. The metal groaned beneath Mercer's weight, but the man did not flinch. His palms pressed flat against the truck's weathered paint, his breathing steady, his composure unbroken. Mallory leaned close, the hot stench of authority turned rancid. "Old soldiers think they matter," he muttered near Mercer's ear, just loud enough for Cole to hear too. "You had your time. Now you're just another name on a license and another weapon off the street." His tone wasn't law. It was cruelty wrapped in the badge's false armor. Ethan Cole shifted uneasily a few feet away, his hand still hovering near his pistol, though his instincts screamed there was no threat here. His rookie eyes caught the truth. Mallory ignored. Mercer's restraint wasn't resistance. It was discipline. It was the stillness of someone who had faced worse and learned that silence was its own weapon. Cole's stomach tightened as he watched Mallory jam the handcuffs around Mercer's wrists, the metal clicking shut with a sound too final, too loud against the hush of the Mississippi night. "Check the glove box," Mallory ordered sharply, not even glancing at his partner. Cole hesitated, his throat dry, but years of drilled obedience pulled him forward. He opened the passenger side door of the Ford, his flashlight beam quivering slightly as he leaned inside. The glove compartment creaked when he pulled it open. Inside, nestled in worn leather, gleamed the heavy steel frame of the Colt M1911. Cole froze for a beat, recognizing not just a weapon, but an artifact, its polished surface reflecting the harsh light, like a relic of another age. He lifted it carefully, his hands steady, but his heart racing. The weight of the pistol was heavy, not just in steel, but in history. "It's here," he called softly, as if louder words might break the fragile tension holding the night together. Mallory's grin widened, wolfish and cruel. "You see, old man's riding around with a killing tool under his dash. Didn't say a word until I dragged it out of him." He turned Mercer roughly, forcing his cuffed wrists higher, pressing his chest harder against the truck's frame. "This is what happens when you think the rules don't apply anymore, when you think your stories make you untouchable." But Mercer didn't wince. He didn't snap back. He simply spoke, his voice low, but carrying across the highway like a steady drumbeat. "I told you what was in there. You didn't ask. You wanted to find something, so you ignored what was in front of you." Cole swallowed hard, his flashlight beam lingering on the Colt in his hand. Mercer's words struck deeper than he expected, threading into the cracks of his own doubt. He looked again at the jacket, the patch on Mercer's arm, an old insignia stitched with care, not decoration. He wanted to say something, anything, but Mallory's presence crushed the words in his throat. Mallory snorted, dismissing Mercer's calm as arrogance. "Save your wisdom, old man. You're not special. Not tonight. You're just another nobody in cuffs." He shoved Mercer harder, the steel biting into his wrists. The deputy's satisfaction wasn't in justice, it was in domination. He wanted Mercer small, diminished, broken beneath the weight of flashing lights and cold metal. But Mercer remained unbroken. Even cuffed, even pressed against the dented side of his own truck, he stood taller in silence than Mallory did in his bluster. His calm was its own defiance, not loud, but deafening. Cole felt it in his bones, a gnawing truth that the rookie couldn't unsee. This wasn't law. This wasn't order. This was one man's hunger for power, colliding with another man's refusal to surrender his dignity. Mallory gestured for Cole to bag the weapon. Reluctantly, Cole slipped the Colt into an evidence pouch, the pistol's history sealed in plastic, like a crime, when in his gut he knew it wasn't. As he zipped the pouch, his reflection wavered against the steel frame, a reminder of how fragile his silence had become. The cicadas had gone still, the wind absent, as though the entire night paused at the spark Mallory had struck. The stop was no longer about a busted tail light. It was no longer about procedure or paperwork. It was about control Mallory thought he had, and control Mercer refused to relinquish. And in that charged silence under the harsh pulse of red and blue, the spark had caught. The fire was coming. The sheriff's station sat like a lone block of concrete on the edge of town, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly against the Mississippi night. The hum of the vending machine by the entrance was the only sound breaking the stillness, until the cruiser pulled in its engine growling low as Mallory swung it into place with the satisfaction of a hunter dragging home his kill. Inside the back seat, Calvin Mercer sat, cuffed, his head tilted slightly toward the window, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The red-blue glare from the light bar flickered across his face, yet his expression remained unchanged, calm, measured, unreadable. He carried himself not like a man under arrest, but like a man waiting for something inevitable. Mallory yanked the cruiser door open with more force than necessary, his irritation still burning hot from the stop. Out he barked, grabbing Mercer by the arm and dragging him forward, though Mercer didn't resist. His steps were even deliberate, each movement, a quiet refusal to be rushed. Cole followed behind his silence, heavy, the evidence pouch, with the Colt .45 gripped tighter than his nerves would allow. He couldn't stop glancing at the older man, at the patches on that jacket, at the strange stillness that radiated more authority than Mallory's shouting ever had. The booking area smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. Deputy Rosa Daniels looked up from the front desk as they entered. She was sharp-eyed, disciplined, and carried herself with the professional distance that Mallory often mocked, but never dared to challenge outright. She frowned as she saw Mercer being led past her desk. "Did you run his ID before you stuck him in cuffs?" she asked, her tone clipped precise. Mallory waved her off, with the dismissive smirk he reserved for anyone questioning his methods. "We'll get to it. I've got enough for a report that'll stick without wasting time on paperwork." He gave a sideways glance at Cole, making sure the rookie heard every word, as though this was another lesson in how real policing worked. Daniels's brow furrowed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's protocol, Brent. You don't throw a man in a cell before confirming his background. What if he has medical conditions? What if his story checks out?" Mallory shrugged, steering Mercer toward the row of cells. "His story?" he scoffed. "He's an old man with a gun he didn't declare." End of story. The cell door creaked as he unlocked it, shoving Mercer gently, not cruelly, just dismissively onto the steel bench bolted to the wall. The cuffs were finally removed, the sound of metal clattering against metal echoing across the tiled floor. Mercer sat down slowly, his hands settling on his knees, his back straight, as if the bench were a soldier's cot, and he was simply waiting for the next order. His eyes shifted toward the large clock mounted high on the wall, its second hand ticking with mechanical indifference. He wasn't watching it with impatience. He was counting it steady as a man timing his breath in a firefight. Mallory dropped into his chair at the booking desk, cracking his knuckles before typing into the computer, his report already swelling with exaggerations. Suspect displayed evasive behavior, he muttered aloud as his fingers tapped across the keyboard. Refused to comply promptly. Possible threat due to concealed weapon. Each word was shaped not to reflect truth, but to fortify his authority. Cole lingered nearby, restless. His eyes drifted again to Mercer in the cell. The old man hadn't moved, hadn't blinked in what felt like a minute. He just sat there, shoulders square. Jaw relaxed, his gaze anchored on the clock. It unsettled Cole, though he couldn't say why. There was no fear in that man's posture, no resignation. There was only patience, the kind that belonged to someone who had waited out far worse than a small-town deputy's bluster. Finally, Mercer's voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was calm, as though he had been waiting for exactly this moment. You ever been in a firefight? The room froze. Mallory's typing paused, his fingers hovering above the keys. Cole's head snapped up, eyes locking on the man in the cell. Daniels, halfway through pouring herself a cup of coffee, stopped mid-motion. The question hung in the air, not a challenge, not a boast, but something heavier, sharper. Mallory let out a short laugh, harsh and dismissive. "Here we go," he muttered, shaking his head. Another old soldier with war stories. Mercer's eyes flicked to him, steady and unblinking. "No," he said softly. "Not stories." His gaze returned to the clock, the second hand ticking onward. "I asked if you've ever had to decide who lives and who dies, while a sniper has a mother in his crosshairs. A mother holding her child." The air drained from the room. Cole felt his chest tighten, his throat dry. Mercer's voice wasn't dramatic, wasn't laced with anger, it was factual, surgical. He spoke like a man remembering the weight of a trigger on his finger, the sound of silence just before the shot. "She didn't speak English?" Mercer continued, his voice dropping lower, the words pulling everyone in. "But her eyes. I knew exactly what she was begging for. Not for herself. For the baby." He paused, his breath steady. "I took the shot. Not proud of it. But I did my duty." No one moved. Even Mallory, who had been ready to mock, sat frozen in his chair, his jaw slack. Cole's flashlight hand twitched involuntarily, the rookie's stomach churning. Daniels lowered her coffee slowly, her eyes fixed on Mercer, her usually firm expression softened by something closer to unease. Mercer leaned back slightly against the steel wall of the cell, his gaze still locked on the clock. "You don't forget eyes like that," he said quietly. "They stay with you. They ask you every night if you made the right call. You can't answer. You just carry it." The silence that followed was suffocating. The hum of the vending machine seemed louder, the tick of the clock unbearable. Cole shifted his weight, unable to look away from the man in the cell. He realized he was holding his breath. Mallory tried to recover, shaking his head like swatting away cobwebs. "He's messing with us," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Mercer's eyes turned back toward him, calm but piercing. "If you think I'm just some old man with a story," he said, each word deliberate, "then you're not paying attention." Cole swallowed hard, his unease now a knot in his chest. For the first time since putting on the badge, he wondered if he had already chosen the wrong side of a line he didn't fully understand. And in the stillness of that Mississippi night, inside a small-town station under the buzz of fluorescent lights, the weight of an unseen history pressed down like a storm, gathering just beyond the horizon. Mercer had not raised his voice, had not lifted a finger, but he had taken the air out of the room. He had forced silence not by demand, but by truth. And even Mallory, swaggering and sure of himself hours earlier on Highway 41, now found himself staring at the man in the cell, unable to summon words strong enough to shatter the calm that cloaked him like armor. The clock ticked on, and everyone in the room knew something had shifted. The keys clacked under Mallory's thick fingers as he leaned over the station computer, the glow of the monitor painting his face in cold light. The tension from Mercer's story still lingered in the air like smoke, but Mallory forced it aside with stubborn arrogance. To him, this was nothing more than an old man playing at being larger than life, a washed-up veteran clinging to scraps of dignity. He smirked as he typed Calvin Mercer's name into the database, each keystroke a small act of defiance, as if the system itself would validate his version of events. Uncooperative suspect, undeclared firearm, another mark on his record of tough arrests. Cole stood off to the side, his eyes flickering nervously between Mallory and Mercer, who remained perfectly still in the holding cell, his gaze fixed on the clock, as though he were counting down something only he understood. Daniel sat stiff at her desk, arms crossed, waiting for Mallory to do what he should have done from the start: run the ID. The screen flickered once, then again. A pause slightly longer than usual stretched across the booking room, and then, without fanfare, a small icon appeared in the upper corner of the display. Not the usual blue flag for minor priors, nor the yellow marker for state alerts. This one pulsed red, stark and undeniable, glowing like a warning beacon from another world. For a split second, Mallory froze, his grin faltering as his eyes adjusted to the unfamiliar symbol. He leaned in closer, muttering, "What the hell is this?" Cole took a step forward, craning his neck to see, but Mallory quickly minimized the screen, his pride refusing to acknowledge the unease prickling up his spine. Across the country, far from the sleepy Mississippi station, the keystroke had already set something in motion. In a fortified server farm buried deep beneath an unmarked facility, encrypted signals snapped awake like watchmen roused from slumber. The red flag wasn't local, wasn't state. It was federal, hardwired to alert agencies that did not tolerate delay. Within seconds, packets of data shot across secure lines, lighting up terminals in rooms where men and women in suits moved with the kind of urgency that small-town cops like Mallory could never imagine. The flag wasn't a suggestion. It was a call to action. And the wheels of authority, once slow to turn, were already grinding forward with lethal precision. Back in the station, the silence broke with the shrill ring of a phone that almost never rang. It wasn't the front desk line where traffic tickets and noise complaints trickled in during the day. It wasn't the sheriff's personal line, which Mallory often ignored. No, this was line 5. The heavy black phone bolted to the back wall, a line so rarely used that Daniels turned her head sharply, brows furrowing. Cole's stomach clenched at the sound instinct telling him that whatever was about to happen was far above his pay grade. Mallory chuckled, shaking off the unease as he pushed himself up from the desk. "What is this amateur hour? Somebody trying to spook us." He strode to the phone with forced bravado, grabbing the receiver like he was about to scold a prank caller. "Sheriff's office." He barked, his voice dripping with impatience. The reply came instantly flat and precise, delivered with a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. "This is Agent Donovan." The voice was calm, sharp, metallic in its control. "You have Calvin Mercer in custody." It wasn't phrased as a question. It was a statement of fact, like someone reading the time off a clock. Mallory frowned, his grip tightening on the receiver. "Who the hell is this supposed to be?" he demanded, trying to inject ridicule into his tone, but the dryness in his throat betrayed him. The voice continued unbroken. "Do not question him further. Do not move him. We are inbound. Estimated arrival less than 7 minutes. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, each one rippling outward through the room. Daniels straightened in her chair, her instincts immediately sensing the gravity. Cole's pulse quickened, his hand tightening unconsciously on the strap of his holster. In the cell, Mercer did not move, did not smile, but his eyes flicked from the clock to Mallory with the faintest glint of recognition, as though this was the moment he had been waiting for. Mallory forced out a laugh, high and hollow. 7 minutes. You've got to be kidding me. He looked over his shoulder at Daniels and Cole, shaking his head like he was sharing a joke. This is a prank call. Some clown messing with us. He pressed the receiver harder to his ear. You listen here, pal. Whoever you are, you don't call my station and start barking orders. I'll run my business how I damn well please. There was no reply. The line clicked once, clean and final, and then went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on the small booking room with invisible weight. Mallory lowered the receiver slowly, staring at it, like it had betrayed him. His grin faltered, the bravado slipping as doubt crept in. Who was it? Daniels asked, her voice sharper than usual, her eyes narrowing at the unusual stillness in Mallory's posture. Mallory shook his head, forcing a scoff as he replaced the receiver on its cradle. Some joker pretending to be a Fed. Probably some drunk with a phone book. Don't worry about it. But even as he said it, his eyes darted to the minimized red icon pulsing faintly on the corner of the computer screen. Cole noticed. He had been watching Mallory carefully studying the cracks in his senior's armor. The rookie's unease hardened into certainty. This wasn't a prank. Whatever had just happened, it was real, and it was bigger than anything the three of them were equipped to handle. His gaze shifted back to Mercer, who sat unmoving on the bench, his eyes now fixed once more on the clock. Cole realized with a chill that ran down his spine that Mercer wasn't counting time, idly. He was waiting. Waiting for 7 minutes to pass. The seconds ticked on, each one louder than the last. Outside, the night seemed to hold its breath, the distant chirp of insects swallowed by the hum of anticipation. Inside, Mallory returned to his desk, trying to resume his report, his keystrokes harder than before, as though pounding the keys could drown out the echo of Donovan's voice. But the words he typed, suspect, uncooperative suspect armed, looked weaker, flimsier under the shadow of that red icon glowing silently in the corner. Daniels rose from her chair, her instincts sharper than either of the men's. She walked toward the cell, her steps slow, deliberate. Mercer turned his head slightly as she approached, their eyes meeting through the bars. For the briefest moment, Daniels saw something in his gaze she couldn't name. Not relief, not arrogance, but inevitability. As if he knew exactly what was coming, and had known all along. "Mallory," she said quietly, her tone firm. "That wasn't a prank." Mallory slammed his palm against the desk, frustration bleeding into desperation. It was nothing some wannabe spook with a phone and a script. But even as he spoke, the sound of engines began to roll faintly through the night outside, low synchronized, too steady to be local patrol cars. Cole's head turned toward the window instinctively, his heart pounding harder. Mercer's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, not of triumph, but of weary confirmation. The countdown was nearly done, and in that moment, the line between small-town arrogance and the weight of true authority began to blur, the clash inevitable. The first sign came not with sirens, but with silence. The insects outside, loud and restless, only minutes before seemed to fade, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Then, the low growl of engines rolled across the gravel lot, deep and synchronized, the kind of sound that didn't belong to small-town patrol cars. Deputy Rosa Daniels turned her head toward the front windows, just as a flood of headlights swept through the glass, blinding in their precision. 3 black SUVs glided into the lot, stopping in perfect formation, their movements too smooth, too deliberate to belong to locals. Cole's stomach tightened his breath, catching in his throat. He'd heard about arrivals like this, read about them in academy training, whispered in stories told by veterans, but he had never expected to see it here on a quiet night in Mississippi. Mallory rose from his chair in a half-stumble, anger covering his growing unease. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, though no one answered. The SUV's doors opened in unison, hinges clicking with crisp efficiency. Men in dark suits stepped out, their presence heavy before they even crossed the threshold. They didn't rush, didn't posture, didn't need to. Their silence was its own weapon, their precision more intimidating than a drawn gun. The station door swung open, and in stepped Agent Donovan. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit that seemed cut from the shadows themselves, he moved with the calm control of someone who never had to shout to be obeyed. His gaze swept across the room, once Mallory at the desk, Cole frozen near the evidence pouch, Daniels standing near the cell, and finally Mercer sitting straight-backed on the steel bench, his eyes meeting Donovan's with the faintest nod. Recognition. "We'll take it from here," Donovan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room with finality. Each word, a command wrapped in calm authority. He didn't announce credentials, didn't wave a badge. He didn't need to. The weight in his tone carried more authority than Mallory's badge ever had. Mallory stepped forward, puffing his chest, his voice cracking slightly under forced bravado. "Now wait, just a minute. This is my station. You can't just walk in here and—" Donovan turned his head, the faintest tilt, his eyes cutting through Mallory with surgical precision. "Paperwork. Footage. Every word spoken since the moment you pulled Calvin Mercer over. Now!" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The demand was not a request. It was law written into sound. Mallory flushed red, his hands balling into fists. "You can't just order me around. I don't care if you're CIA or FBI or whoever the hell you think you are. This is my jurisdiction." He spat the last word like a weapon clinging to it, as if it might shield him from the storm rolling over his head. Donovan stepped closer, his presence quiet, but crushing like gravity itself had shifted. He spoke softly, but the words struck harder than any shout. "You are detaining a protected federal asset. Step aside." The phrase landed in the room like thunder reverberating off every wall. Protected federal asset. Cole felt the words sink into his chest, hollowing out his stomach. Daniels's eyes widened slightly, the steel of her composure bending under the weight of the revelation. And Mercer, still seated on the bench, closed his eyes for half a second, as if exhaling a truth too heavy to explain. Mallory blinked his bravado, faltering. He glanced at Cole, searching for some unspoken confirmation, but the rookie looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The authority Mallory had wielded so confidently on the side of Highway 41 was evaporating, stripped bare under the cold, precise weight of Donovan's presence. Behind Donovan, more agents moved into the station with quiet efficiency. One carried a black case, snapping it open on the booking desk to reveal a secure laptop. Another gathered the body cam units and dash cam drives, his hands, steady movements, clinical. They didn't ask permission. They didn't explain. Every action they took was inevitable. The kind of inevitability Mallory had never faced in his small dominion of flashing lights and late-night traffic stops. "Hey! Hey! Mallory!" shouted, his voice cracking, desperation bleeding through the cracks in his tone. "You can't just take my evidence. That's county property. I'll have your badges for this." Donovan turned his gaze back to him, his voice as cold as iron. "Officer, if you believe you have authority here, I invite you to call the Pentagon directly. Lines open 24 hours. The sarcasm was absent. The invitation was real. And it was terrifying. Mallory's mouth opened, then closed his throat, working but no words forming. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured vaguely toward Cole. We were just doing our job. Donovan didn't blink. No, you were making a judgment. A poor one. The silence that followed was suffocating. Cole felt his chest rise and fall too quickly, his lungs straining. He looked at Mercer again. The man still calm, still patient, still waiting. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't triumphant. He was simply steady, like someone used to the inevitability of storms. Daniels finally spoke, her voice clear, though tinged with the unease pressing down on everyone. "Sir, I wasn't involved in the arrest. I was on desk duty." Donovan's eyes flicked to her softer for the briefest moment. He gave a single nod. "Then you're clear." The distinction hit Cole like a punch. Clear, not clear. Protected, not protected. The divide was obvious, brutal, final. And standing on the wrong side of it, Mallory looked smaller than Cole had ever seen him. His swagger gone, his authority stripped, leaving only a man clinging to excuses. At the booking desk, the agent with the laptop looked up. Body cam footage secured. Dash cam secured. Audio log copied. All files logged and encrypted. His voice was flat, efficient, the sound of machinery disguised as man. Donovan gave a single nod, then turned back to Mallory. His eyes were sharp, his voice low, but cutting. "Every insult, every shove, every word you spoke to Sergeant Mercer tonight is now preserved on a federal drive. And it will be reviewed." Cole's breath hitched. Sergeant Mercer. The word lingered in the air, reshaping everything. Not suspect. Not old man. Sergeant. The truth was finally breaking through the cracks Mallory had spent the entire night denying. Mercer opened his eyes, lifting them to Donovan with quiet acknowledgement. "Took you long enough," he murmured. His voice was weary, not mocking. Donovan allowed the faintest shadow of a smile, brief as lightning. Traffic was a mess. The agents continued their quiet dismantling of Mallory's authority, each action another stone pulled from the foundation of his control. And as the night wore on, the booking room no longer felt like Mallory's kingdom. It felt like an outpost occupied by something far greater, a reminder that real authority did not swagger or shout. Real authority arrived in silence, in precision, in inevitability. By the time the clock on the wall struck midnight, the power Mallory had wielded so carelessly hours before was gone, replaced by the cold, undeniable truth. Calvin Mercer was not just a man in a dented truck. He was a name that echoed in rooms Mallory would never enter, a past sealed in files Mallory would never read. And Brent Mallory, once so sure of himself on the side of Highway 41, now stood exposed in the harsh light of authority that dwarfed him completely. And still, Mercer sat quietly in the cell, his calm deeper than the silence that followed, waiting for the storm outside to fully arrive. The hum of the station's fluorescent lights seemed louder than ever, a steady electric drone filling the silence that followed Donovan's command. Mallory stood stiff near the desk, his face pale, and drawn, his bravado bleeding out with every second. Cole shifted uneasily beside him, the rookie's wide eyes darting between the agents, moving with fluid precision, and the man in the cell who sat straighter now, almost as if his patience had finally reached its end. Daniels remained still, her arms crossed, but even she could feel it. That heavy sense that the walls of this small-town station were about to hold truths far larger than their cinder-block frames were built to contain. At the booking desk, one of Donovan's team plugged the secure laptop into the system, his fingers gliding across the keyboard with speed and certainty. Another agent, younger, with sharp eyes, and the clipped tone of a professional used to being ignored until it was too late stepped forward. She carried a thin folder pressed tight to her chest, a black lanyard swaying gently against her suit jacket. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. When she spoke, the room's oxygen shifted. Agent Maya Grant, federal analyst, she introduced herself, though her voice lacked any sense of performance. It was efficient, clipped, like each syllable had been weighed before being spoken. She placed the folder onto the desk, opened it, and drew out a sheet of paper covered in dense text, much of it blacked out by thick bars of redaction. Her eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on Mercer in the cell. For the first time, Mercer's lips curved into something that resembled acknowledgement. He gave her the faintest nod, like a soldier recognizing another who carried burdens unseen. Grant's voice was calm, but it cut through the booking room like a blade. Calvin Mercer, retired Sergeant Major, United States Army, formerly attached to a classified task force operating in the 1980s and early 1990s. Her eyes flicked to Mallory, who blinked rapidly, his mouth parting in disbelief. Task force assignments were never disclosed to the public. They operated in locations that, for official record purposes, did not exist. Mallory opened his mouth to scoff, but the words stuck in his throat. Something in Grant's delivery, flat, factual, stripped of theatrics, snapped his instinct to mock. This wasn't a story. This was a record, Grant continued. Sergeant Major Mercer received multiple commendations during his service. Many remain undisclosed, but they include citations from the Pentagon and a Medal of Valor tied to operations that were not and will never be released to the press. She paused, her eyes lifting again, this time toward Cole, who stood frozen as though each word was a weight stacking higher on his shoulders. Some of those operations prevented mass civilian casualties. Some reshaped outcomes of conflicts you've only read about in textbooks. But the public never knew his name. That was by design. Cole felt the air press heavier against his chest. He thought of Mercer's voice in the cell earlier describing the sniper, the mother, the child. At the time it had felt like a story meant to unsettle them. But hearing it now couched in the cold delivery of classified fact, the memory clawed at him in new ways. Mercer hadn't been telling a story. He had been remembering. Grant's tone sharpened, shifting from biography to present danger. 4 weeks ago, Mercer's name appeared on a leaked list from an old Defense Intelligence Agency archive. The list was compromised during a breach. Since then, 3 names tied to that same archive have gone missing. She let the words hang, her eyes narrowing slightly. Calvin Mercer is now a target. Active. Daniels sucked in a quiet breath, her composure cracking at the edges. Cole felt sweat bead at the back of his neck, and Mallory's jaw hung open, his face pale, his fists clenching and unclenching with the helplessness of a man realizing he had pulled the pin on a grenade without knowing it. Grant's attention shifted to the evidence pouch sitting on the desk. She gestured, and one of the agents lifted it gently, setting it in front of her. Through the clear plastic, the Colt M1911 gleamed faintly, the worn steel carrying the patina of decades. It wasn't just a gun, it was a relic. Grant's fingers tapped lightly against the plastic as she spoke. This sidearm, she said, is not just registered. It is historically significant. In 1989, during an attempted embassy overrun in South America, this very pistol was discharged in a mission that prevented the deaths of over 200 civilians. That operation never made the papers. The official report labeled it an evacuation drill. But this weapon was the difference between a headline about mass slaughter and silence. Cole's throat went dry. He stared at the weapon, suddenly unable to reconcile the simple pouch of steel with the weight of the lives it had once shielded. His mind replayed Mercer's calm words from earlier. You didn't ask. I told you." Now those words burned like truth, etched into stone. Grant's voice lowered slightly, but it carried an even sharper edge. "Do you understand what you seized when you shoved him against his truck? You didn't just arrest a man. You compromised a federal asset, tied to operations still sensitive enough that nations would pay millions to get their hands on him or this weapon. You exposed him." The silence in the room was deafening. Daniels's jaw tightened her eyes, flicking to Mercer with newfound respect. Cole felt the floor shift beneath him, his rookie certainty collapsing into something unsteady, dangerous. And Mallory stood trembling, his hands shaking, as though every ounce of his swagger had drained through the soles of his boots. Mercer finally shifted in his seat, his voice cutting through the thick air with calm precision. "That's why I told you to ask before you assume." His eyes locked on Mallory's not with anger, but with the weight of truth pressing down like judgment. A little respect would have gone a long way. Mallory opened his mouth, desperate for a retort, but nothing came. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, his throat closing against words that could no longer shield him. He had mocked Mercer, sneered about old soldiers clinging to relevance, and now the revelation crushed him under the truth. This old soldier had carried history on his shoulders, while Mallory carried nothing but arrogance. Agent Grant closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Sergeant Major Mercer is to be released immediately," she said. His property returned. "And every detail of this arrest logged for federal review." She turned to Donovan, who gave a single nod, then back to the stunned deputies. "You may consider this your formal notice. Everything you did tonight is now part of a federal record. And every word will be weighed." Cole swallowed hard, his eyes finding Mercer again. The old man sat steady, dog tags glinting faintly beneath the collar of his jacket. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't smug. He looked tired, weary, as though the revelation wasn't a victory, but a burden he had hoped never to bear again. The Colt rested on the desk, silent, its history humming louder than the fluorescent lights. And in that Mississippi station, under the gaze of federal eyes and the shadow of classified history, the truth stood naked. Calvin Mercer was no nobody in a dented truck. He was a man whose name carried weight in corridors Mallory would never enter, whose past had saved lives that Mallory could never imagine. And now, because of a tail light and an assumption, his shadowed world had come crashing into theirs. The cell door swung open with a metallic groan, the sound sharp and final like a curtain being pulled on the end of a performance. Donovan didn't need to raise his hand or bark an order. The agents around him moved in perfect rhythm, one keying in the release code, another stepping aside to clear the path. Calvin Mercer rose slowly from the steel bench, his joints creaking faintly, but his posture was upright, dignified, steady. The weight of his years didn't show as weakness. It showed as endurance, a spine forged in fire and sharpened by storms. He stepped out of the holding cell, not like a suspect freed, but like a soldier answering roll call, and the air in the booking room shifted around him. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum softer. Agent Maya Grant held out the sealed evidence case, the Colt M1911 nestled inside like an artifact behind glass. Her hands were careful, almost reverent, as she offered it back. "You're cleared, Sergeant Major," she said simply, her voice devoid of ceremony but rich in finality. Mercer accepted it with a nod, his fingers brushing the plastic, like one touches a relic of both pride and burden. He didn't cradle it like a prize. He held it like a reminder. Then his gaze turned. He looked at Mallory, not with fury, not with vengeance, but with something heavier, disappointment. The kind that strips a man down further than any curse could. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, low, but each word landed like a hammer striking iron. "Respect," he said, his eyes boring into Mallory's, isn't something you give after a background check. It's something you should have given when you looked me in the eye. The words detonated in the room, not loud but seismic. Mallory flinched, his jaw tightening, his hands twitching at his sides. The weight of those syllables cut through the armor of his badge, his authority, his years of swagger and intimidation. Everything he had built in this county, the smirks, the strut, the dominance he wielded over the powerless, crumbled in the face of a truth too plain to ignore. His authority stripped bare was nothing more than arrogance, dressed in a uniform. Cole felt his throat constrict as he stood frozen near the booking desk, his chest tight with the realization that he had watched it all unfold and said nothing. Every shove, every insult, every unnecessary order he had followed, silent, obedient, complicit. His silence wasn't neutral. It had been permission. The rookie's heart pounded in his ears as Mercer's words echoed inside him, reverberating louder with each beat. Respect isn't something you give after a background check. Mallory tried to salvage his crumbling authority, forcing a crooked smirk onto his face. "We were just doing our job," he muttered, his voice unsteady, cracking at the edges. But even he knew the words were hollow, flimsy things that could no longer shield him. Donovan didn't even bother to turn his head. Agent Grant's eyes flicked toward him with cold disdain, but neither spoke. The silence was worse than reprimand. Mercer stepped closer, the case in his hand, his shadow falling across Mallory. "Maybe next time," he said softly, "you'll ask before you assume." His tone carried no malice, no heat, just the weight of inevitability. It was a sentence, not a suggestion. Mallory's breath hitched. His skin flushed red, not from anger, but from humiliation. His power drained like water, slipping through his fingers. The badge on his chest, once a shield he had wielded like a weapon, now felt like dead weight. In front of federal agents, in front of his rookie partner, in front of Mercer, the man he had mocked as a nobody, he stood exposed as small, petty, irrelevant. Cole lowered his eyes, shame burning hot in his gut. He thought of the stop on Highway 41, the way Mercer had moved slowly, deliberately, and how Mallory had twisted it into defiance. He thought of the moment Mercer had said, "You didn't ask," and how he himself had stayed silent, letting Mallory's cruelty carry the night. He thought of the patches sewn into Mercer's jacket, the signs of service he had noticed, but ignored, because silence was easier than confrontation. And now, standing in the ruins of Mallory's arrogance, he realized he had been part of it. His silence had not shielded him. It had chained him. Mercer turned back toward Donovan and Grant, his expression steady, almost weary. "Let's be done with it," he said, the fatigue in his tone betraying the truth. Vindication was no triumph. It was simply survival. Donovan gave a nod, and the agents moved with efficiency, gathering the last of the files, disconnecting the laptop sealing drives into black cases. The room no longer felt like Mallory's station. It felt like a courtroom, and the verdict had already been delivered. Daniels, who had watched with arms crossed and eyes sharp, finally spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "You didn't know who he was?" she said quietly, but her gaze pinned Mallory in place. "But you should have treated him like a man, not a suspect." She wasn't defending Mercer's status. She was naming the truth, plain and simple. And her words, layered with Mercer's, struck deeper still. Mallory swallowed hard, his throat dry, his bravado gone. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of his own choices had finally settled. He glanced at Cole, perhaps searching for solidarity, but the rookie looked away, unable to carry Mallory's shame on top of his own. Mercer adjusted his jacket, his dog tags clinking faintly against his chest as he prepared to leave. He paused once more, his eyes sweeping across the room. "The real danger isn't out there tonight," he said softly, almost to himself. "It's in here. In the way you see men like me before you know their name." His voice carried no bitterness, only a tired truth. The agents ushered him toward the door, their formation fluid, practiced. Donovan cast one last glance over his shoulder, his words like ice against Mallory's skin. Every word, every action, every smirk is on file now. And it will be reviewed. Then he was gone, his team melting into the night as quickly as they had arrived, leaving only silence in their wake. The hum of the fluorescent lights returned louder than before. The booking room seemed smaller, emptier, its authority gutted. Mallory sank into his chair, his hands trembling, the computer screen still pulsing faintly, with the red icon he had tried to dismiss. Daniels returned to her desk, her professionalism unbroken, but her eyes hard. Cole stood frozen, his lungs aching as though he had been holding his breath for hours. The collapse of false power had come not with a fight, not with raised voices, but with calm truths spoken by a man who never needed to prove himself. Mercer had walked out with his dignity intact. Mallory remained behind, stripped of everything but his own humiliation. And Cole, young and shaken, finally understood silence was not safety. It was surrender. The night along Highway 41 had begun with flashing lights and swagger. It ended with the undeniable truth that respect is not earned through intimidation or force. It is given freely, without condition, without assumption. And once withheld, its absence can destroy careers, reputations, and illusions in a single night. The weeks that followed unfolded not with fireworks or scandals splashed across television screens, but with the slow, steady weight of consequence pressing down on those who had believed themselves untouchable. The sheriff's station, once the center of Mallory's swagger, grew quieter, its halls heavy with whispers that carried more judgment than any formal reprimand could. Word spread fast in towns like this, first murmurs over coffee at the diner, then half-spoken questions at the hardware store, and finally open talk in church pews and barber shops. People didn't know all the details, most never would, but they knew enough something had happened on Highway 41, and the deputy who strutted too loud had finally met a force larger than himself. For Officer Ethan Cole, the rookie who had stood silent that night, the consequences came like a slow bleed. At first, there was no announcement, no headline, just a quiet memo from the sheriff's office, reassigning him to desk duty. Temporary reassignment, pending evaluation. The paper said neat and clinical, but in the world of small-town law enforcement, everyone knew what it meant. The patrol car keys were gone, the badge still polished but dimmed, and the path forward narrowed to nothing. He now sat behind a desk each day, filing reports he hadn't written, stapling papers that weren't his answering phones with the voice of a man already half forgotten. The sound of the radio chatter about traffic stops and disturbances cut into him worse than any reprimand. Each call reminded him of the night he hadn't spoken, the silence he had mistaken for safety, the complicity that now defined him. His career wasn't over, not officially, but it was stalled in the way a truck rusts on blocks in a front yard, visible to all but going nowhere. Deputy Brent Mallory's fall came harder, sharper. His badge, once worn like armor, was stripped away under the cold words of indefinite suspension pending federal review. No ceremony, no defense, just a letter and a signature. The man who had barked orders, who had made late-night stops into theater, who had thrived on being the loudest voice in the room, now sat in his own home with silence pressing down heavier than any courtroom sentence. He stormed into the sheriff's office the day he got the notice, red-faced fists clenched, demanding explanations. But the sheriff's eyes, tired, simply gestured to the federal seal stamped at the bottom of the letter. "It's out of my hands, Brent." Mallory stormed back out, but the fight had drained from him before he hit the parking lot. He had lived for the authority the badge gave him, and now that authority was gone, his swagger nothing more than a memory. Folks chuckled about behind his back. He was no longer feared, no longer respected, no longer relevant. Deputy Rosa Daniels, by contrast, remained untouched. In fact, her record gleamed brighter in the aftermath. Her insistence on protocol that night, the reminder that ID should have been run first, that procedure mattered, was now vindicated. She hadn't touched Mercer, hadn't joined in Mallory's taunts, hadn't stood in silence like Cole. She had carried herself with professionalism, and professionalism had shielded her. In the weeks after other deputies looked at her differently, their respect less grudging, more real. She didn't boast, she didn't gloat. She simply continued her work, her sharp eyes watching the world with the same discipline that had saved her from being pulled into Mallory's downfall. And Mercer vanished back into the folds of quiet life, the kind of disappearance that left only questions behind. Folks at the diner swore they saw his dented Ford pickup rolling down the highway one morning, the driver's brimmed cap low over his brow. Others said they caught a glimpse of him at the hardware store buying nothing more than oil and a handful of nails. But no one could ever pin him down. He left no statements, no interviews, no trace of wanting the story told. What lingered instead was the memory of him walking out of the station that night, his dog tags swinging gently in his hand. He hadn't raised them like a banner hadn't shown them as proof. He had simply held them, the worn metal glinting faintly under the lights, a reminder that dignity doesn't need an audience. He walked into the Mississippi night, steady, unhurried, as if the world outside the shadows, the whispers, the dangers belonged to him and him alone. But for those who had been there, the deputies, the agents, the town, the words Agent Donovan left behind were the echo that refused to fade. Standing in the doorway before leaving with his team, Donovan had looked at Mallory, at Cole, at Daniels, and finally at the sheriff himself. His voice was even quiet, but it landed like the toll of a bell. "You didn't just arrest a man. You exposed the blind spot that endangers us all." Those words spread like wildfire, carried from deputy to deputy, from officer to officer, whispered in academy halls and department meetings. The blind spot. It was more than just the mistake of pulling over the wrong man. It was the assumption, the arrogance, the failure to see the human before the suspect, the veteran before the stereotype, the truth before the judgment. It was a warning written into the silence of Mercer's calm, into the collapse of Mallory's bluster, into the regret sitting heavy on Cole's shoulders. Weeks later, Highway 41 still ran dark and lonely through the pines, its shoulders marked by the echo of flashing lights long since gone. But for those who had stood in that booking room, who had heard Mercer's voice and Donovan's judgment, the road was no longer just asphalt and paint. It was a scar, a reminder, a lesson burned into the landscape. Cole drove it sometimes off-duty, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than they should, his eyes catching on the place where the stop had happened. He thought about speaking up, about what might have changed if he had said something, anything to slow Mallory down. The silence replayed louder than the sirens ever had. Mallory avoided the road entirely. He sat at home, his patrol car long since reassigned his nights, filled with the restless silence of a man stripped of his shield. Sometimes he would look at his badge suspended in limbo and feel the hollowness of what it had been worth without respect to give it weight. Give it. And Mercer walked on his figure, vanishing into the kind of night only men like him could survive. His dog tags clinked softly in his palm, each step carrying him further from the arrogance of small men and closer to the solitude he had always known. He was not vindicated. He was not avenged. He was simply himself, calm, steady, dignified. And for those who remembered, that was more powerful than any punishment the system could deliver. In the end, the lesson was simple, though few lived at power without respect, is nothing but noise. And silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality, it is complicity. The night on Highway 41 had shown it plain. Some would forget. Others never could. And in that truth, Calvin Mercer's shadow stretched longer than the flashing lights ever could, a reminder that authority is fragile, but dignity endures. The story of Calvin Mercer on Highway 41 is not just about one man in a dented truck, or one deputy with too much swagger. It is a mirror held up to all of us as American citizens. It asks us hard questions. How often do we judge before we ask? How often do we mistake calm for defiance or dignity for arrogance? Mercer's lesson was clear. Respect is not something to be rationed out after paperwork and background checks. It is the starting point of every human interaction. For Officer Cole, the rookie's silence seemed like the safe choice. But in truth, it was complicity. And his stalled career is a reminder that doing nothing can be just as dangerous as doing wrong. For Deputy Mallory, arrogance, masquerading as authority, crumbled the moment real power walked in. His suspension shows us that false authority can last a week, a year, even a decade, but it cannot survive the truth. And for Deputy Daniels, professionalism and protocol proved to be her shield proof that integrity, even in small moments, can carry you safely through storms. Mercer himself walked away with nothing more than his dog tags. In hand, a quiet man carrying dignity as his only weapon. And yet he towered over them all. And then came Agent Donovan's words, which should echo in every city, every county, every household. You didn't just arrest a man, you exposed the blind spot that endangers us all. That blind spot, racial bias, quick judgment, careless silence, is not confined to one Mississippi highway. It exists in our schools, our workplaces, our neighborhoods. The call to action is not just for officers in uniform, but for every citizen. Speak. When silence tempts you, respect. Before you assume, and never forget that dignity belongs to everyone, not just those with titles or medals. As Americans, we must choose vigilance, not complacency. So if this story resonated with you, if you believe that respect and justice are lessons worth remembering, do not keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with your family and friends. Let it travel farther than Highway 41, so that the next time arrogance flashes red and blue lights in the dark, dignity will already be waiting.